In the 1920s, a man named Herbert Stoddard told the United States government that the way to save the southern forest was to burn it, not clear it, not log it. Set fire to the ground under the trees on purpose and do it again in a couple of years and again after that forever. This was close to heresy. The federal government at that moment was building its entire forestry doctrine around one idea, which was that fire is the enemy. The lookout towers, the ranger crews, eventually the bear in the hat telling children that only they could prevent it. All of it pointed one direction. And here was a quail biologist saying the healthiest forest in the American South was the one that burned the most often. They did not listen for a very long time. By the time they did, about 95% of that forest was gone. An ecosystem that once covered something like 90 million acres from New Jersey down through Florida and west into Texas had been reduced to scattered fragments. The bird that lived in it had fallen from an estimated 1.5 million to under 10,000. Today, crews walk that forest with drip torches and set the ground on fire deliberately. The United States military does it on hundreds of thousands of acres because the Army needs the same thing the woodpecker does. And in October of 2024, that bird was downlisted from endangered to threatened. But fire alone did not do it. When they finally started burning again, the forest came back and the bird did not, and the reason why is one of the strangest bottlenecks in American conservation. It came down to a hole in a tree. If you had walked into a longleaf pine forest 300 years ago, you would probably not have called it a forest. It looked like a park. Tall, straight pines spaced far apart, the crowns high overhead, and between them, open ground covered in knee-high grass and wildflowers. You could see for hundreds of yards. You could ride a horse through it at speed. There was almost nothing at eye level. And that open floor was the richest part. In the ground layer of a healthy longleaf savanna, you can find dozens of plant species inside a single square meter, which makes it one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in North America. Gopher tortoises dig burrows in it that end up housing something like 360 other species. Then, in about a century, we took almost all of it. The trees went first. Longleaf grows slowly and lives a very long time, and the primeval forest had pines that were 150 to 400 years old. That old-growth timber was superb structural lumber, and between the late 1800s and the 1930s, most of it was cut. Not thinned, cut. Whole counties were logged out and the mills moved on. Alongside it ran the naval stores industry, cutting gashes into living trees to bleed them for turpentine. And when the land got replanted, mostly it did not get replanted with longleaf. Longleaf takes its time. Loblolly and slash pine grow faster and pay sooner, so millions of acres of savanna became dense commercial pine plantation, which looks like a forest and functions like a warehouse. But logging is not the whole reason the ecosystem died, and the second reason is much harder to see. Even where longleaf pines were left standing, the thing underneath them started dying anyway. Longleaf savanna is not a place that tolerates fire. It is a place built by fire. Lightning strikes the southeastern coastal plain more than almost anywhere else in the country, and for thousands of years those woods burned every few years, low fires that ran through the grass and went out. Native peoples burned it too, deliberately, for generations. That constant low fire is the only reason the forest was open. Fire kills oak seedlings and shrubs. It does not kill mature longleaf. So every few years the competition got wiped off the floor and the grass came back and the pines kept their space. Take the fire away and none of that is true anymore. Hardwoods and shrubs move into the understory and nothing removes them. Within a decade or two, the open floor is a thicket. The grasses and wildflowers get shaded out and die. Longleaf seedlings, which need bare sunlit ground, cannot establish, so no new pines come. The savanna is gone long before the last pine falls. The bird that depended on all of it is called the red-cockaded woodpecker. There were once an estimated 1.5 million of them across that same range. By the time the Fish and Wildlife Service listed it as endangered in 1970, the population had fallen below 10,000. Here is where it gets uncomfortable, because the thing that finished off this ecosystem was not greed, it was care. Through the first half of the 20th century, the United States built one of the most effective fire suppression systems on Earth. That effort was not stupid. Catastrophic fires had killed a lot of people, and the goal was to stop that from happening again. It worked. We got very, very good at putting fires out. In the South, that meant stamping out a practice that had been going on for centuries. Rural Southerners had burned the woods every winter for generations, the way their parents had, because that was simply how you kept the woods usable. Government campaigns went through the region to teach people that this was destructive and backward and had to stop. So people stopped. And the Longleaf ecosystem, which had been maintained by exactly that burning, began to close in and suffocate under the protection. This is the part that makes the story worth telling. The forest was not dying from neglect, it was dying from being looked after. Every year that a fire did not run through the understory was a year the hardwoods gained ground, and the more successfully we protected it, the faster it collapsed. Stoddard had worked this out in the 20s when he was hired to find out why the bobwhite quail were disappearing in the red hills of Georgia and Florida, and concluded the woods had simply stopped burning. He argued it for decades. Prescribed fire took most of a lifetime to become mainstream forestry rather than a fringe position, and by then the acreage was down to a few percent of where it started. But when fire finally did come back, something did not add up. Land got burned. The grass returned. The savanna structure started coming back on managed properties, and the woodpecker population kept sliding anyway. Restoring the habitat was not restoring the bird. Two things had to be understood, and the first one is best explained with a lawn. Stop mowing a lawn and you do not get more lawn. You get weeds, then brush, then saplings, and in 20 years, you have a scrubby patch of woods. The grass was never surviving in spite of the mowing. The mowing was the only reason the grass was winning. Fire mowed the longleaf savanna every few years for thousands of years. That is the entire mechanism. Longleaf is built to take it. Mature trees have thick insulating bark, and the seedlings do something remarkable called the grass stage, where for years a young longleaf looks exactly like a clump of grass, putting almost everything into a deep taproot, while a dense tuft of needles shields the growing bud. A fire runs over it, and it survives, and when it is ready, it bolts upward fast. Even the cones are in on it, because the resin sealing them softens with heat. Everything else in that understory dies in a fire. Longleaf does not. Fire is not something the forest survives. Fire is how longleaf wins. So the fix was not to protect the forest, it was to become the thing we had removed and put the fire back on a schedule forever, which left the second problem, the bird. The red-cockaded woodpecker does something no other woodpecker in North America does. It excavates its nest cavity in a living pine, not a dead one. Living wood is far harder to dig, and there is a reason it bothers. The tree bleeds resin from the wound. The resin runs down the trunk in a sticky curtain, and that curtain stops rat snakes from climbing to the nest. The bird is deliberately building inside a tree that will defend it. The cost is time. Digging into living heartwood can take a woodpecker years, and it is only practical in old trees, usually well over 60 years old, where the inner wood has begun to soften. And by the 1930s, America had cut down nearly every tree that old. So the bottleneck was never food. And after the burning resumed, it was not really habitat either. It was housing. You could restore a perfect savanna and the birds still could not live in it because there were no trees old enough to move into, and waiting for the young pines to age would take longer than the species had. The answer came out of research at North Carolina State and Clemson in the late 1980s. And it is almost comically simple. You cut a rectangular block out of the trunk of a living pine, roughly the size of a brick. Then you glue in a prefabricated wooden box with a chamber and an entrance hole already carved into it, and patch the front so it looks like a cavity, an artificial insert. A woodpecker apartment installed in an afternoon in a tree far too young to have one. Nobody was sure the birds would accept it. They accepted it immediately. The proof arrived as a disaster. In September 1989, Hurricane Hugo came ashore in South Carolina and tore through the Francis Marion National Forest, which held one of the largest remaining populations of red-cockaded woodpeckers in the world. The storm destroyed most of the cavity trees in that forest. Overnight, a population that had taken decades to build had nowhere to live, and a lot of the birds were gone. That should have been the end of it. Instead, crews went in and installed artificial cavities across the wreckage as fast as they could put them in trees. The surviving birds moved in. The population held, and then it climbed. What had been a technique in a research paper turned into a proven emergency tool in front of everybody. It is now standard practice. Today, roughly half of the red-cockaded woodpecker breeding population in the southeast is living in cavities that human beings installed. The two pieces together are what turned it around. Fire restored the savanna structure, and the inserts solved the housing shortage that fire could not fix. And a large part of the scaling came from an unexpected direction. The United States military owns enormous tracts of the Southeast, and it turns out soldiers and woodpeckers want the same landscape. Open ground with good sight lines and no thick brush is ideal for training, so installations like Fort Stewart in Georgia became major conservation operations, protecting land, establishing Longleaf, and burning across hundreds of thousands of acres. The Department of Defense ended up one of the most important restoration partners in the country, and it got there because burning the woods made its own job easier. The numbers tell the rest. More than 2 million acres restored in about 15 years through America's Longleaf Restoration Initiative. Longleaf acreage up from around 3 million at the low point to somewhere near 5 million, roughly half the breeding woodpeckers now living in installed cavities. And on October 25, 2024, the Fish and Wildlife Service formally downlisted the red-cockaded woodpecker from endangered to threatened after 54 years on the list. Now, the honest part. This is not a species that has been saved and released. The service was explicit that the bird remains threatened and at risk of becoming endangered again because the populations are small and a single bad hurricane can still take one out. The total sits somewhere around 10 to 15,000 mature birds in about 7,800 clusters across 11 states. That is a recovery from the edge, not a return to what was. And the ecosystem is still at roughly 5% of its original range. Step back and look at the shape of it. We cut the old trees, which took the housing. We replanted with faster species, which took the structure. And then, with the best intentions anybody has had in this entire story, we protected what was left from the one process that had been keeping it alive, and it began to strangle quietly under our care, while everybody involved believed they were helping. The lesson underneath that is not really about pine trees. Some systems are not maintained by peace. They are maintained by regular survivable disturbance, and if you remove the disturbance because it looks like damage, the system does not get healthier. It gets soft, and then it fails in a way that is much harder to reverse than the thing you were preventing. But there is one more piece here, and it is what makes this story different from every other one on this channel. Every other comeback we have covered ends the same way. Take the wall out and the salmon come home. Put water on the playa and the birds land. Fill in the canal and the river finds its own bends. In all of them, the job is to stop interfering, and then nature takes over and finishes the work without us. That is not available here. The natural fire regime that built this forest cannot come back on its own. You cannot let lightning fires run freely across a coastal plain covered in highways and subdivisions and towns. The disturbance this ecosystem requires is now something only people can deliver on a schedule with drip torches and burn permits and crews, every few years, indefinitely. And half the birds are living in boxes we installed and will have to keep installing, so this recovery has no finish line. If we walk away from the southeast for 30 years, the savanna closes in and the whole thing goes again. Most of these stories end with us stepping back. This one does not end at all. The forest does not need us to leave it alone. It needs us to show up forever and set it on fire. Subscribe and watch the world come back to life.